A fundamental issue in education is the nature of consciousness and the nature of mind. We really need to think about that. The nature of consciousness is to help us move through the world. You see that, remember, all animals have a consciousness. We got to generalize from that. They have a consciousness so they can move through the world to find food, to avoid predators. They've got to go through a complex environment. So depending on the animal, it is a certain type of consciousness and certain abilities or a certain nature to move through things and do certain things, like some wasps to build a nest. It's just part of their nature. They don't have to kind of learn how to do it. It's an automatic part of the way they function. And if we look at different animals, we see it's the same thing. Raccoons, dogs, cats, possums, kangaroos, elephants, whales, dolphins, fish, insects. They all have a consciousness, all these animals, as opposed to plants. Plants can affect each other through chemicals. You've got one tree and another tree, and there can be some kind of chemical interaction through the ground, through the fungus and everything. One thing affects another, affects another, affects another, affects the other tree. This cause-effect sequence, but that's different than consciousness, which is the ability of one thing to move through its environment. I think some people make mistakes about what consciousness is, and that causes further upstream in our thinking and philosophy. It causes some mistakes in education. For example, Plato. Plato thinks the mind is basically about observing things, pure and perfect concepts. Sense perception is something that just distorts reality and confuses you, takes you away from the true essence of things. So you got to turn away from the world to really be conscious. You got to turn inside and notice how that's basically the idea of a crazy person. Would you want a doctor working on you, especially when doing brain surgery, who's going to turn away from the world and the evidence of the senses and do some pure and perfect operation on you? As for me, I wouldn't want him near me. People in general, we shouldn't want around like that. Would you want someone who believes that to build a bridge? The bridge is going to work because they feel like it, and it's the pure and perfect form of a bridge. Nothing to do with causality of the world or all this messy sense perception. For me, no, thank you. So Plato has this kind of passive view of consciousness. It's just a passive awareness of concepts in some other dimension. That's the basic essence of his view. If you'd like to make some distinctions and comments below, just we can talk about it. Now, some people also believe that consciousness is a representation of the world. So we're not aware of the world. So we are aware of the world in some respect, as opposed to like Plato, but these people think, kind of caught up in the Platonic thinking, that we're just aware of our representation. So we represent the world. So it's kind of like you're in a movie theater and you can watch the movie, but you don't know what's going on outside yourself. You're kind of blind to it. That's another mistake. And so things like this are going to cause education to be done wrong. For example, by some views of consciousness, if it's passive, you just memorize things, you follow an authority because they already have learned about these pure forms, so you just do what they say. If they do give you some application, it's just thrown out there for the less developed, those who aren't a philosopher king, those who think they need practical action. They're just kind of appeased by throwing things and doing these little experiments. But in a proper view of consciousness, we should learn ideas and learn their context of applying to reality. We should see how they help us move through the world and achieve values. Every idea, every perception has an implicit movement component, action component to it. That's part of an aspect of it to help us move through the world, achieve values, avoid predators, find food, be happy. When we get to something, animals such as us, more complex on a higher level, and if you really dig into the way animals function, read books about animals by experts and not just think about people who don't know much about them and are just engaging in ignorant comment or prejudicial comment, but you see apes and elephants and dolphins and killer whales have a rich social structure. They do a lot socially. They're not stupid, blind animals that just do whatever. So consciousness helps us also move through the social environment. And of course, the people, there's even more going on. We're rational animals. Other animals are perceptual. They might have some preconceptual forms of mental function, but they're not fully conceptual and rational as we are. It's not us versus them, totally different. We're very different in some ways we function, but there's a lot more similarity. If we study animals, we can learn a lot more about who we are and how we function and what consciousness is. I think we have mind, they just have consciousness. Some people might say they have mind, but then they have to differentiate between our mind and their minds, and why not just use the concept of mind for us and consciousness for everything else? The distinction's already there, it's fine. But if they want to say we have a certain type of mind and they have a different type of mind, as long as you're defining terms and being rational about it, that seems legitimate to me. But I go with saying we have a mind and everything else is a consciousness. Mind is a type of consciousness. But we need to think about things like that when we're learning as a student, when we're living our lives, when we're teaching. Think about what, education's about training someone's consciousness, their mind to do something. The mind in particular, not just training as in a consciousness. Lots of things have to learn, yes, but we have a different type of learning. We have conceptual learning. Other animals do have very advanced forms of learning, but some chimpanzees or something, I forget the exact animal, has fashions. Like I heard a story about one chimpanzee or whatever putting a piece of grass in her ear, and that became a fashion, this leading female, and that became a fashion for others in the area. Or some of them have a game where they'll put water in a little hole and stir it, and they're all in little groups stirring it. And some researchers, like Van Wall, he'll call it making soup or cooking. So they do have some advanced activities, and they can engage in some fads. They do have kind of, for want of a better word, kind of political infights going on, power fights to see who's going to lead and all that. But we're doing a lot of the same thing, but on a conceptual level. So we need to realize that, to go back to the point, education is about training the mind, which is a form of consciousness. We need to grasp its nature and realize that it's about action, moving through the world. So all knowledge should have, it should be taught this way and treated this way when we learn and teach, and when we live. All knowledge has an action component. It's related to everything else. If it's about moving through the world, we should know how it relates to as much as possible in the world to know how it relates. Just as if we see a tree ahead, we don't just go, oh, there's a tree out of nowhere. Is there another tree right next to it? Is there a bunch of shrubbery? Can we pass right by the tree on a trail? Or is it far off on a cliff? Is there too much shrubbery around it to get to it? What kind of tree is it? If it's an oak or some other types, we can climb it. If it's a prickly ash, stay away because it's going to hurt. Or a devil's walking stick, it's going to have a ring of thorns around it. Prickly ash has thorns all up and down. So the context it's in matters. We want to put things, ideas, in a context for a movement and action orientation. I hope this helps. So I know it's like a fundamental, deep topic, something to think about. It took me a long time to understand, so you won't necessarily get it right away, but no big deal. I mean, heck, it took me years and years. thinking, trial and error, reading people. Just think about it and try to integrate it in your thinking. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. Or want any follow-up videos, let me know.